Do we have the previous one back up just for a tick? One of the very powerful images in that reading is the chasm between, like after the two men had died, between the rich man and Lazarus, after they've died. So I think that's a hugely, well, it's kind of the opposite image of what we've been talking about before, about connection and how Christ and God connects all of us and all of creation. And yet this story is talking about a circumstance where there's this great chasm between us, disconnecting us. Okay, we'll go back on the other one. and this is from our friend Kirsty Woodward, who, and it's an expression of that connection I was talking about. You know, they're very much connected to the earth through the Creator. These figures simply represent the work of the Creator in their lives, and their relationship with the Creator is expressed in that way, in the spirit of creation, and how that is their source, and it just grows and connects all of them together, people as well as the whole creation. So too often this story, as Peter said, can be taken as a literal description of heaven and hell. A simplistic story, that if you live like this, you know, rich or poor, then this will be what happens to you after you die. Hell or heaven, respectively. And there were a lot of stories like that around in Jesus' time, but he does not seem to use them in that literal, simplistic way. If Jesus had started the story by saying there were two Irishmen who arrived at the pearly gates and waited in line to see St. Peter, then we'd all know, oh right, there's a little signal, how to listen to this story and how to get some message from it. Because there were lots of stories like that sort of frame. You know, we're used to those sort of stories, but there were lots of stories with similar sort of nature and fashion in Jesus' time, and this is kind of like one of those. It would never occur to us in one of those sorts of stories to take all the details literally and draw maps of geography of heaven out of them. But it seems fairly clear that that is pretty much what Jesus was doing here in terms of taking a little funny story almost and then trying to make a point out of it. Taking a conventional folk tale, if you like, and giving it a tweak of his own, as he often did, to make a point. And the point is certainly not those descriptions of conditions of heaven and hell. When Jesus takes these sort of tales and reworks them, the point is always something to do with the audience that he's talking to, and also whatever the little twist is that he puts in. The setup of the story usually gives us a lot of clues as well. We've just had the parable, like earlier in Luke chapter 16, and in chapter 15. First in 16, closer to it, we had this parable of the shifty business manager. And Jesus comments about not being able to serve both God and money. That's what sort of comment he makes after that parable. And then Luke says in his writing, the Pharisees, who were lovers of money, heard all this and they ridiculed him. And then there's a couple of sayings, and then Jesus tells this story that Peter just read. So we have a story of a rich man being sent to hell, being told to a group of rich but proudly religious men. So some of the implications seem pretty obvious, but we'll get back to that. But first though, we'll look at the twist at the end. At the end of the story, the rich man calls from the hellfire, asking for Lazarus to be sent back to the brothers to warn them to change their ways, not to do the same mistake that he made. And the twist comes when the rich man is told that there's no point in sending Lazarus back, because if they won't listen to Moses and the prophets, then they wouldn't be convinced even if someone rose from the dead. So that's a pretty clear reference to Jesus and his resurrection. And because Luke's writing after the resurrection, of course, and who's paying attention to that, and who's changing their lives as a result. The hard-heartedness that is out there in the community in response to Jesus' resurrection. The unwillingness to reach out from people's wealth to those in poverty. That goes way beyond simply being unconvinced that there might be future consequences. So in addressing this story to some money-loving Pharisees, as Luke describes them, who took issue with his applications of the parable of the shifty business manager, you can see how Jesus is building this story on the foundation of that earlier parable. The shifty business manager might have been a crook. And like when you read it, you think, yeah, he's a crook. But he seems to be treated unusually sort of fairly. One of the things that's highlighted in that earlier parable is that he used the money that he had at his disposal to help some other people. Even if his primary motivation was self-interest, he still did something to help other people. But this rich man in this story doesn't use his money for anyone but himself. Thinking about the Pharisees and their love of money is pretty important to getting our heads around this story as fully as we can. You see, it's not just about wealth. In fact, when people have oversimplified the story, this story, to say that the poor will go to heaven and the rich will go to hell, sometimes they actually use that paradoxically to justify doing nothing for people who are poor now, because they'll be all right later on. That clearly would not be in the teachings of the one who taught us to pray for God's will to be done on earth as it is in heaven. So the really important thing about why this is addressed, not just to some people who love money, but to some Pharisees who love money, is that Jesus really wants to get at an attitude about the relationship of righteousness to prosperity. These particular Pharisees are very much into both righteousness and prosperity. They believe that their prosperity was a consequence of and a proof of their righteousness. You may have heard of prosperity theology, the teaching that if you do what God wants, God will make you conspicuously wealthy. Well, although most Christians now, and indeed most Jews of Jesus' day, would reject that, a more subtle version of it was and is extremely widespread. In fact, most of us probably hold to it at some level. So we would be seriously deluding ourselves if we identified ourselves with Lazarus and didn't see that we actually are a whole lot more like the rich Pharisees to whom Jesus was directing the story. Because at some level, most of us imagine that at least part of the reason why we have enough food to eat, and enough clothes to wear, and a roof over our heads, is because we feel like we're good people and we deserve it. And most of us, at least on occasions, when passing a beggar in the street, have found ourselves thinking in a similar way. Even though we might fight that thought and think, oh no, that's not a good thought, Andrew. Don't think like that. At some level, we can still think that those who end up on the skids, if you like, are probably reaping what they've sown. Some little niggling thought deep down in us can be like that. And if they'd just been a bit more responsible like us, they wouldn't have fallen on such hard times. Of course, the flip side of that same thought is never far from the surface either. If bad things are happening to us, we will sometimes ask ourselves, well, what have I done wrong to deserve this stuff? It's kind of the same idea, just the other side of it. I've always tried to be good. Why are these terrible things happening? So it's entirely understandable that we want to hold on to these ideas, because it's one of the only ways that we can feel that we have any control of our destinies. It gives us some sense of being able to hold the forces of chaos by way of maintaining our standards. And on its darker side, it also enables us to walk right on past Lazarus, being at the gate, and look the other way. The tragedy is that the more we do that, the more entrenched becomes the pattern. And the more entrenched our world becomes in the same pattern. And the harder it is to turn it around, and everybody loses. The deep chasm Jesus depicts between the rich man and Lazarus is a chasm that we are digging ourselves. The more we dig ourselves into thinking that not only are we the well-off and they are the poor, but we're the righteous and they're the unrighteous. We are the solution and they are the problem. We are the saved and they are the damned. The wider we start thinking like that, the more unbridgeable is that chasm. And not only does that further entrench poverty and misery as unchangeable in the world, but it increasingly cuts us off from the mercy of God. Not because God withholds the mercy, but because we have so bought into a system that sees everyone getting what they deserve, that there's no room for mercy. When we get rid of grace from our worldview, we condemn ourselves to living in a world without grace. We dig our own unbridgeable chasm. And it's only in contemplating the suffering of a perfectly innocent man that we can begin to refill the chasm and dismantle that false idea that the divisions of success and suffering are deserved and ordered. It's in contemplating God's own entry into the suffering of the world, the suffering of the world's impoverished and tortured victims, that we can finally see that these divisions have got nothing at all to do with God's rewards and punishments. It's in contemplating the tortured demise of one whose name we know and love that we can begin to understand that all who suffer are named and loved brothers and sisters. Did you notice that Lazarus is named in the story, while the rich man is not? Quite the opposite of the world we live in. But when Jesus is stripped of everything and cast out to die, he bids us to stop seeing the poor simply as a nameless mass called the all. We give them plenty of other labels as well, but that's the one for this story. And so God empowers us to restore to them names and identities and dignity, and to stand in solidarity with them as ones who all together stand in need of God's mercy and who have a claim on one another's mercy and compassion. If we approach a relationship with God confident that we have earned our right to be there by our own righteousness and success, we've missed the point. On the other hand, if we approach relationship with God imagining that we are more like Lazarus than like the rich Pharisee, we are probably deluding ourselves. But if we can approach relationship with God knowing that though we are relatively well-off religious types, we are using what we have to help enable our brother Lazarus to get there, then we can approach God together, arm in arm, both equally undeserving of God's mercy and love, both equally dependent on the mercy of God, and then in relationship with God. Hosted by the crucified one, we will find the chasm filled in and taste the world made new and know ourselves risen from the dead. Amen.